including starting with the introduction to speakers.
So hello everybody. In our first panel, we discussed the use of AI. Now we're going to discuss the safety included in the role endeavor. It's a nice point to jump on because, as we noticed, most questions at the end of last panel were asking about what's the ethics involved in wolfing. So, Shirley, do you want to introduce our speakers?
Yeah, great. So today we have Albert Yoon over on my left. He's professor and chair in law and economics at the University of Toronto. We have Arvind Gupta. He's the former president of UBC and current visiting professor in computer science at U of T. And we have Abhishek Gupta. He is an AI ethics researcher at McGill University. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, he sends his regrets because of it's a very potent flu season here. Stay safe out there. So we have.
Oh, that's me. Okay.
So the format is the same as last session. We will have opening remarks from our panelists and then some time for questions afterwards.
So thanks very much for the invitation, Jesse. And so I come at machine learning from wearing a couple of different hats. One is as an academic, and my background research is using data to analyze how judges make decisions. And then the other hat I wear, a couple colleagues of mine at the law school, Ben Allery and Anthony Niblett, we have this academic startup called Blue Jay Legal, in which we use machine learning to answer complex questions in law. And so we started in the world of tax, and now we're data and employment. The idea is that there are questions that you can ask machine to answer. They can do this very accurately, and you can do it in a short amount of time, and really improve the capacity of lawyers to be able to do law practice. So what I'd like to talk about today is thinking about machine learning with more of the academic hat. So when Jesse told me about this conference, he was raising issues of ethics. And this comes up in machine learning when almost immediately when you start thinking about law. So I'm hoping to cover some of that. And so when we think about machine learning, it's kind of all the buzz. Right? So machine learning is this area of artificial intelligence in which you can leverage data in such a way that you can make predictions. And so this is very different from the way that we thought about data in grad school. In grad school, we think about data from a statistical approach in which you're trying to explain the world. Right? You have a hypothesis about how the world works, and for those of you who data on the right-hand side, you have the variables that you think are explaining what's going on the left-hand side. And really, what's important is not just maximizing the predictive value, but really trying to have an understanding of how the world works. And so when you think about OLS analysis, what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize the bias in the way that you answer the question, but of course you introduce variance, so you can have predictors that tell you something, but there's huge standard errors, and so you don't need to detail that. Now with machine learning, it's kind of the reverse, which is to say, what you want to do is you want to minimize the variance. You want to, but you're willing to sacrifice some bias. That is to say, you're willing to introduce some bias if really what it allows you to do is to make more accurate predictions. And so some of you may already be thinking, well, as we start thinking about its applications to law, and potential conflicts can arise. So one of the interesting phenomena in law, and no one has accused law of being particularly nimble profession when it comes to technology. And so, not too long ago, certainly when I was in law school, we were really kind of in the analog era where things were still important. So if we want to look up the precedent of a case and how it kind of falls over time, we would actually go to a physical book. And we had Westlaw and Lexis and some of these other data libraries that we were told not to not to use it too much because when you get to the firm, it's quite expensive. And so we still live in this physical world. But around the same time, law started to digitize things. And the first things they digitized was judicial opinions, and then statutes, and then commentary, and then law reviews. All these things were becoming digitized. And back in the 90s, there's this huge paywall before it exploded. And so if you wanted ready access to this, you paid a subscription. And that model still exists, although it's quickly kind of breaking. Well, this third stage is computational. So as more data becomes available electronically, then you can start harnessing that information to try to do lots of things with it. So we see this in lots and lots of walks of life. You see this with Moneyball, for example. Baseball. This idea that, well, you don't have to send scouts out to watch every game. You just look at data, and that data is going to tell you something about that in ways that you wouldn't necessarily observe when you're just watching the actual event. Okay, so how does machine learning relate to law, and then how does this introduce potential ethical concerns? So, two areas in which machine learning has been applied recently has been in the area of criminal law. So the first area is crime prevention, and what researchers and companies are starting to do is they realize there's just this whole wealth of data. For example, police precincts know of all the crimes that happen in an area. And back in the day, you would have detectives who would look at all the crimes. They would have a map, and they would say, here where all the crimes are happening. Where do we think the next crime is going? It would be based on a lot of impressionistic understanding of all the cases. And there are researchers at Duke who have started to try to come up with a more systematic approach. What they do is they have all this information. They know exactly, for example, when the crimes occur, what part of the house they broke into, what they took, time of day, what vehicles, if any, were observed and typically there. And so once you start having all this data in electronic format, you can actually start making predictions about maybe where the next crime is going. So that's crime prevention. The other area is criminal bail. So criminal bail is this one area, for those of you who are lawyers who follow the law, it's incredibly opaque. We think about the legal profession as having all this transparency, opinions, judges make decisions, and they're memorialized. Well, it turns out judges make decisions all the time as it relates to bail, and there's just no paper trail. Someone comes in, and the judge is making a decision. Should I let this person out? And how much should I post bail? And if I am going to let them out, so they set all these conditions, and they just move on. They just churn through lots and lots of cases. And anecdotally, there's evidence to suggest that they're not consistent across judges, and they're not even consistent within judges. Right? So there's this famous article that talks about how judges, after lunch, they're more grumpy. And so by the end of the afternoon, they just want to get home. And so if you have the misfortune of being a litigant in the late afternoon, you observe worse outcomes than if you were in the fresh. So these are things that obviously are far from the ideal. So all these things are great because machine learning basically means you can harness this data to make better predictions about who's going to violate bail or where the next crime is going to be. And that's good as far as it goes. But the problem, the challenges that machine learning raises is that machine learning at its core is atheoretical. So it began by saying when you think about analyzing data from a traditional kind of statistical approach, you have a theory for how the world works. Machine learning it's much more of a black box. That is to say, you have the data, and they're trying to find the patterns. Right? It's almost kind of and because it's atheoretical, in some ways it's amoral. It doesn't have a normative framework. I don't mean to suggest it's immoral, but it's amoral. It doesn't have these normative underpinnings. It's something that can move in different directions. And so, the constitutional considerations we stand out on these ethical considerations that follow. So I'll just describe this just in the U.S. context. So when you're trying to predict where the next crime is going to be, you have all this information. The question is, what information is fair game? Right? So, for example, would you want to use information where you can trace people's cell phones? And there have been these cases where the cell phone use pinging off towers gives a very close geographic reference point to where the crime is. And so the question there is that a violation of one's faith? So this type of surveillance begs the question whether it's appropriate, because typically when you get a warrant, you have probable cause. There's something you're telling the judge about that particular person, as opposed to statistically speaking. So machine learning and surveillance approaches are not really honing in on the individual, they're making a statistical inference. And that creates some tension with these constitutional considerations. And then second, with criminal bail, there have been a couple of companies that are proprietary. So what they do is they go to courts and say, we can offer you this tool that allows you to better predict whether someone's going to violate that. But we can't tell you what's under the hood because that's proprietary. And the problem that creates, of course, is if you're a defense attorney, you want to be able to say, well, I actually want to know how you reach that result. There has to be a process that we care about. Did you make this determination simply because my defendant is male, or because my client rather is of a particular ethnicity? And of course, if a judge said, yeah, you know what, that's why I did it, then that would be immediately constitutionally suspect. And the problem, of course, with these black box algorithms is nobody really knows. And of course, they have no incentive to share this because then you could just reverse engineer. In fact, the same professors at Duke came up with a very parsimonious, transparent model, which is like, this predicts at least as well as the best proprietary model, and it's free. So it'll be interesting to see what will evolve over time. I think, again, one of the biggest challenges is there's this tension between making money from machine learning and having transparency. And law, particularly in criminal matters, demands this type of transparency. And I think there's going to be some tension with surveillance and now bringing this kind of full circle to stuff that we're doing at the startup. We have machine learning to help tax accountants or tax lawyers best predict how the tax court of Canada is going to decide a case. For those of you who are still listening, that doesn't raise the same constitutional considerations, right? Because it doesn't speak to someone's fundamental rights. It's really about sophisticated parties trying to make the best prediction about how court will decide cases. So I think there's certainly lots of potential applications of machine learning in law, and I think the challenge is picking. Thanks very much.
Apologies. It's gonna really quickly go back.
You have a little technical problem with the speaker.
Hi, so I'm Abby. I guess I'll give you a little bit of context on where I'm coming from, what my background is, and then we'll dive into some of the nitty-gritties. I think that it's been a topic of interest for everyone, as was evident from the previous panel. There's a lot of questions around that, so it's great for me as an AI ethics researcher. That's what I do. It's great to see other people who are interested in it and care about it. So that's great. So I got my degree in computer science from McGill, and I come from a technical background, so it's fun for me to do the programming behind different neural network approaches, GANs and whatever else is the latest and greatest with the field of deep learning. So my sort of interest in this field of the ethical development of AI began when I was in Geneva at the AI for Good Summit, where it was quite evident that the Europeans are much further ahead in their both understanding and sort of practical implementations around addressing some of these concerns. And when I came back to Montreal, I realized that being an AI R&D hub, we were just missing the ethical piece in terms of our conversation. And I think it probably is the same for Toronto, though I can't say that much to it because I'm from Montreal. So yeah, that's it. So I'm an AI ethics researcher from McGill, and I do research at Concordia as well, out of District 3. So I think one of the first points that I want to cover is we keep talking about this idea of ethics in AI, right? Like it's been brought up so many times, but we've had these challenges before as well, right? With different kinds of technologies that have come out. So why is it different this time? Why, what is unique about this? What is different about this? So I think when we think about it, really what's happening is that we have these sort of semi-supervised settings where we're deploying decisions on the lives of different people at scale. So what we're able to do is automate that entire process of decision making, but also do it. Part of it is powered by the proliferation of the internet and smartphones, everybody having access to it. But these decisions having a macro impact on the lives of many different people, and the depth of impact is on crucial aspects of our lives, right? So I think Howard made a good point about the bail and how it's set by these black box systems. So the program, I don't know if you were referring to the Compass program in the United States, but I think ProPublica published that article. I think it's been 2 years now, where essentially they were calculating criminal risk scores, and inadvertently it was biased against African Americans. And if you do a more thorough analysis, what they realized was that it was the underlying data distribution that triggered these let's call them bad decisions, right? So and the importance of this is that we are impacting people's lives who these are fathers, these are mothers, these are sons and daughters who can't go back home because we've misattributed their criminal risk scores. And maybe I'll clarify one thing here, where what happens in popular media is we tend to diverge away from discussion on the practicality of it, and I'll touch upon it in just a bit. And people talk about AI safety in the sense of Terminator, killer robots, or Skynet, or those sorts of things. But it actually consumes public thought on things that are very hypothetical. And I've spoken to Joshua Benju, one of the godfathers of this field, and he has the same view on this, saying that these are things that are one, very hypothetical, and two, quite far away in terms of actually being possible. So instead, it behooves us to focus our discussion on what is practical and how it's impacting the lives of people today. So if just to I guess continue on that trajectory, when we're looking at sort of these mission critical systems, so and mission critical, I use that term loosely to I guess the bail, deciding bail, or doing medical diagnosis, where if you are prescribing a particular treatment that has deleterious effects, like let's say chemotherapy, and it wasn't needed, you're again impacting someone's life. So I believe the value of human oversight is still relevant there, and I guess we'll get into the nitty-gritties when we open it up to discussion with everyone. But what we see in the medical field as an example is a lot of people argue, well, doctor's head is like a black box as well. Can you ask the doctor to go from the inputs that you've given the doctor all the way to the output and give his or her entire reasoning? Often that's not the case. A lot of it is what we would dub as intuition. So, but how do we counter that? We counter that by having them go through a rigorous training process, for them to be go through an accredited institution, to have vetted credentials, and in the case of something going wrong, they have let's say malpractice insurance. So you have a certain amount of due process that helps you address the negative consequences that might come out of that. And then I guess you're the legal expert and you can talk a bit more about it. But when we talk about assignment of liability in these systems, how do you reconcile that when there is no clear ownership of who's making that decision? And I think I won't belabor too much the transparency and explainability, but I think they're quite closely related. The one point that I would like to make is perhaps veering away from the use of the word black box, because I think it projects the wrong image in the mind of people, where we think that we can't look into this. As a practitioner, you can look into it. You can look at the weights that are set in different layers of, let's say, a convolutional neural network. The question is that they are not human interpretable. So I can't tell, looking at layer 17 in this convolutional neural network, as to what it represents or what abstraction it has. So its understanding of, let's say, take the example of an apple. When you look at an apple, you have an understanding in your mind of the shape, the size, the texture, the color, the smell. But the way the machine looks at an apple is different. It looks at it in terms of pixel densities, in terms of contours, in terms of edges, vertical, horizontal, at an angle. So the understanding is very different, or if you can call it an understanding. So there's something to be said about that. I guess I'll touch upon it a little bit in terms of the degree of responsibility and who should hold that responsibility. As someone who writes these programs, I think the responsibility should lie with all of the stakeholders that are involved in that process. And when I'm talking about all the stakeholders, I'm talking about people who are conceiving and designing the project all the way to the end of life. I'm talking about people who are developing the solution, who are deploying it, who are maintaining it. All of these people are responsible for different parts of any negative consequence that might arise. Now again, how do you assign the liability, and how much of it goes onto the heads of which of those participants is a whole other story. But I think it's important that we don't leave out anyone in that entire value chain, because even people who are conceiving and designing the system had a critical say in how that system came to be, and that might result in some sort of bias, let's say, in the system. Again, inclusivity around everybody. I think someone in the previous panel touched upon it in terms of the representativeness of the underlying data set. So making sure, and that's not a solved problem in terms of being able to figure out who composes your target audience in terms of when you're going to use the system. And the metrics for evaluation, what I mean by that there is that you should have these metrics at all stages of development, deployment, maintenance, and not so much the end of life, but all throughout that process. Because you can have something that passed with flying colors in the training process, but when you're testing it out in the wild and interacting with real-world examples, it might not hold up to the same standards. So you need to be able to account for that. And I'm a big advocate, again, at least in the Montreal ecosystem, on the practicality of the ethical development of AI. So again, there's, without a doubt, unless you go to, I don't know, different parts of the world where, let's say, Trump is king, where people will, disagree with you on, bias and, sexism, racism, these sorts of things. But, talk to anyone else, there is a, great deal of agreement in terms of these higher level moral imperatives. So no one will disagree when they say that, the system should not be gender biased. But as a practitioner, as someone who's, building and testing these systems, what can they do to ensure that these systems don't have those biases? So I think one of the key points, and again, someone in the previous panel I think brought it up, is education and sort of training requirements. And this, you have this in, let's say, civil engineering, where there's a strong code of ethics in terms of how they build, and the degree of integrity and responsibility that they have. Let's say when they're building bridges, and Montreal would know about that. We've had a few that have fallen. So in computer science, I think this is more and more important, where you have things which impact billions of lives at the same time. I don't know if any of you read the article. It was in November last year, where they were talking about YouTube Kids. So I don't know, quick show of hands, do people know what YouTube Kids is, or have heard of it? Okay, so it's this part of YouTube where you're supposed to have videos that don't have any explicit content, don't have violent content. It's supposed to be generally safe for children. You would let your kids loose on that, not have to parent them, I guess. That being the underlying assumption. But what happened there was that people started to leverage the fact that the platform was optimized for selecting videos that show up in your feed, so as to say, in terms of how long you would watch it. Because that is a key metric in the success of the YouTube model, is that you would watch it for longer, and then presumably they can make more ad revenue off of it. So what ended up happening was that the content was, started with things like, let's say Bugs Bunny and Porky Pig running around in a garden doing whatever, and kids are fine with it, right? To slight variants where, Bugs Bunny chops off Porky Pig's head, and maybe in a cartoonish setting, it is okay. But then what started to happen was there was both human-generated content that was a variant of that, and machine-generated content that just spliced together different segments of the video and created many copies of these, right? Where it got increasingly macabre and psychologically disturbing. So while it is okay to see maybe one video that shows off Bugs Bunny chopping off Porky Pig's head, consistently being shown disturbing images of them boiling it, dismembering, or any of these sorts of things that you would find on HBO, I think is damaging in the long run to children who are in their formative years. So again, when you don't have the right metrics and you're optimizing for the wrong thing, I think it creates a problem. And having someone who at least has a fundamental understanding of these ethical concerns or can envision those concerns is very important. So these education and training programs right at universities, when you're taking a computer science degree, having a course or a series of courses would help people manage these rising issues, I think I've exceeded my time. We're short one panelist, so.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting us and for Massey College for hosting this interesting discussion. My name is Arvind Gupta. I'm soon to be a professor of computer science here at U of T. My research focuses around the underlying foundational aspects of computation. What can computers do, what can they not do? Understanding what they can do with the resources we have available versus problems we might be able to solve. We have very, very large amount of resources in huge amounts of time. And so it's very interesting to see the very rapid development of deep learning. I'm old enough now to have seen many different instantiations of artificial intelligence and lots of sudden interest in new techniques, and then sort of often a letdown that these systems weren't in this promised nirvana of machines being able to do everything for us. So I just say that because I'm always a little worried that we get caught up in the hype sometimes, and it's important to separate the hype from what actually is possible. Deep learning is a very interesting tool because it allows us to build models of phenomena without necessarily understanding what the underlying mathematical structure is for that particular model. So it's more of a generic model building for a particular instance. And while we've had the techniques for at least 40 years, we now have the computational power to build sophisticated enough models that they're giving us something interesting. And so we're just at the front end of understanding what can't be done. We're, I'd say, almost not even at the front end of understanding what's going on under the hood. But clearly there are things going on that are giving us interesting capacity that we haven't had before. So it's an area that we have to think a lot about. Now, I'm a professor in computer science, and there is a whole view in the discipline that it's not our job to worry about the ethical considerations of the kinds of things we produce, that we are there to solve problems, and someone else should worry about the ethics of the solution that we're providing for solving a problem. And I think that's becoming an antiquated notion. It was a lot easier to think that way when I was a graduate student because we hadn't actually gotten to the point of solving sophisticated problems that had real underlying moral and ethical consideration. I mean, for the most part, we were developing small-scale systems, and maybe it's an exaggeration, we weren't making life and death decisions. And often, if we thought we were developing systems that could help predict medical diagnosis, a doctor would come along pretty easily and fool those systems and goes back to the drawing board. So One of the famous examples from the 80s I remember was a program called Prospectus, which seemed to be able to predict where oil could be found. And people were very excited because it found like 3 major oil fields in a row. And then someone discovered that the program actually had been hardwired because they were testing it. So it wasn't predicting anything other than hardwired locations that someone had put in, and they just guessed right. But really, we were in this very strange world of grandiose vision and very tiny progress, and that has shifted, right? So over time, we've had systems that can do much more. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the kinds of ethical considerations that our students should be at least aware of and perhaps trained to think about, and how we can, what kinds of training we might give them. Recognizing that this is really a very gray area. And for every time one thinks in a certain way, you come up with an example, say, well, actually, that's not quite right, because here's an application where if you use this particular definition, you wouldn't do this other thing, which is probably the right thing to do. So a big area is military. We have a lot of funding from the military, especially DARPA. DARPA is extremely interested in the ability of AI systems to make independent decisions in the field. We're seeing a lot of investments even by the Canadian military in robotics and robot soldiers. Whether I'd say human soldier that's wearing a robotic outfit that gives them much more capability, but more and more purely robotic soldiers that could go in and act like human soldiers, or probably more efficient, use that word. We've seen in the last 20 years the capacity of drones to do huge amounts of damage. And when there's this much push by the military to develop automated reasoning systems, I think it's time for us to step back as a field and think about what contributions we're making. These automated systems are making real life and death decisions. They are going and killing people. And I want to understate that. Much of modern warfare is done through sophisticated decision-making robotic systems. And while one can convince themselves that each little piece of that is morally okay because you're not actually the grand designer of the system, the grand designer is the military. And one has to think about their role in designing the systems. The other thing to think about is many of these systems are inherently flawed. Humans do pause before they kill other humans. They feel bad. I mean, we know that a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder is because of things happening out in the field. Machines do not feel bad. And removing those ethical and moral considerations that humans have when they're out in the field means that we as humans actually remove ourselves from that decision. It's a robot that did it. It's a drone that went out there. I'm sorry it bombed the school instead of that place that we think was a cache of weapons, but I didn't make the decision. And we've essentially removed that decision making from everyone up and down the pipe. The general that sent that drone in says, well, the designers did it. But there's 1,000 designers, each designing a little piece of that system. Each of them can argue that they are not morally responsible for killing 200 school kids. Yet somehow as human beings, we kill 200 school kids. Often we're killing in these areas without even reflecting. I find it really interesting that when humans did this, it would be headlines in the paper. Now that we've got machines doing it, we barely notice it on the 19th page of the New York Times. So I think it's something we have to start thinking carefully about. What is the role of everybody up and down the pipe? People who fund it, people who design it, people who use these systems in these kinds of applications. The second thing to think about is, while we're developing this technology, is there a role to think about embedding morality into the very essence of the technology? We have seen systems develop to recognize criminals. And there's lots of stories that these systems, of course, recognize certain ethnic groups because they're showing pictures. 10% of US, 10% of black men in the US will end up in jail you start showing pictures of criminals to a deep learning system, there's a good chance it's going to have a strong ethnic bias. You take out that ethnic bias, there's a strong chance it's going to have a socioeconomic bias. Recently, someone developed a system in which it started recognizing individuals that had bipolar and had not had help to control, psychological help to control their bipolar. In other words, if you were rich enough to hire psychologists, you could cover the fact you're bipolar. These are really strong ethical dilemmas. Do we want such systems out there? There's systems that bias towards ageism, that believe that, you know, as you get older, you may not be capable of doing certain things, which of course is protected, right? We're not supposed to be ageist. What if a system is biasing in this way? There's a different kind of bias that's happening in these systems. You know, why does Google invest so much money into deep learning and artificial intelligence? Well, one of the reasons is, you know, always follow the money. Where does Google make money? They make money by putting ads up in front of you. They make money if you click on those ads and you buy things. Now, if you think about it, how can they get you to buy things? They have to find your vulnerability. If you have a propensity to become addicted to gambling, they want to show you ads that may simulate gambling. So you're more likely to get hooked to those kinds of ads and use them. If you have a propensity to smoke, or you're young and impressionable and think smoking is cool, they may find mechanisms to show you ads that don't look anything like smoking but target those exact receptors in the brain. So what is the ethical consideration if you're designing such systems that micro-target populations that have the propensity to take on certain behavior, like gambling, smoking, other behavior? The contraposition of that is good behavior. So we might have systems that try and reinforce good behavior. For example, there is a system out there that's a smart garbage can that before you throw something away, will tell you, you know, this can be recycled. You should put it in the recycling bin. Or this can be composted. You know, please put it in the composting bin. That sounds great, right? But if you think about it more deeply, systems that elicit positive behavior can have some pretty unintended side consequences. Because we can start trusting those systems to make decisions that really are judgment calls. They may decide that you're not capable of driving your car. Now, if you're inebriated, that's great. If your kid has fallen down down some stairs and you need to get them to the hospital, the system decides you're not capable of driving. Who takes responsibility for that decision? The next thing to think about are system failures. All of these systems fail. They fail for many different reasons. First, systems are only as good as their programmers. Deep learning systems are only as good as their programmers. All sorts of biases can creep in. We talked a lot in the first panel and this panel about bias. We know that these systems can change behavior by having different training sets. We know the underlying structure of the neural net can change the behavior of the system. So given that these systems are inherently flawed because their designers are inherently flawed, what responsibility do we take when we develop these systems? Especially a problem if we don't realize right away that these systems are flawed. We may make all sorts of decisions based on systems that are flawed. I talked about prospectus earlier as sort of a funny anecdote to what happened. But just think about if that was being used for life and death decisions and there was an inherent flaw in the system, who took responsibility for that? There's also another problem. These systems are getting hacked. A little while ago, the Tesla network got hacked, and somebody started driving around a Tesla car. And a lot of people think it's kind of funny that a 12-year-old started driving a Tesla car. Suppose that car killed a group of individuals. Who's responsible? Is it Tesla that's responsible? Is it the internet? The owners of the internet that are responsible? The wireless company responsible? Who takes responsibility if that system gets hacked? There's two other considerations that I just want to talk about briefly that I think we shouldn't, or at least those of us on the technology side should be less, we should be attuned to them, but maybe not be reflecting them as much into the systems we design. The first is the rights of individuals affected by AI. For example, work displacement. These systems are coming that are going to cause disruption in the workplace. There's a study out of Brookfield that says 42% of skills are most likely to be automated in the next 20 years. There could be huge worker displacement to the level that we haven't seen since farms got automated in the late 1800s. You know, in the early 1800s, 80% of people worked on farms. By 1910, 50%. Today it's 3%. We could have similar large-scale displacement of service sector workers. So far, automation has affected goods production. We've kind of felt services are a human trait, hard to disrupt, but then Blue Jay comes along, and suddenly unemploys half the lawyers out there. These are white-collar, highly educated jobs that are now being targeted by the systems. So I do get people saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be developing these systems because we don't want people to lose their jobs. But my view is it's inevitable that people will develop smarter systems, and we should be at the cutting edge of that. And it's better to reflect on how we reap the benefits of such systems for society rather than just say that we're not going to develop these systems. These systems are going to be developed. And we would like to have the expertise in this country to develop these systems and not have it go elsewhere. So that's one place that I don't think it's fair to say that our students don't develop these systems. We do want systems that make life better. We've done this throughout humanity. We've developed tools, and this is another tool. The second place that I don't think we should be worried as much about are the ethics. And do we want to give, let me say this, do we want to give rights to AI systems? So there's a big area of study that talks about the rights of robots. And so Isaac Asimov, you know, was it 5 laws or something? But a lot of people started talking about the rights of robots. Lots of movies, right, where you develop these new systems that take on some kind of human-like cognitive sense and have self-awareness. I personally think we are so far away from anything like that. We are just, you know, miles and miles and miles away that we could spend a lot of time talking about the right of a robot, but it's a really purely theoretical exercise that may be great for an ethicist or a philosopher. I don't think it's the kind of thing that computer science in our field we need to really be thinking about. I think we should talk more about the fact that we are really far away from having any system that has self-awareness, and therefore, let's not get bogged down worrying about something theoretical that might happen 500 years from now. That's me back to what I said at the beginning. I've seen 4 waves of suddenly thinking we're going to have these machines that displace human cognitive sense, and each time we realize these are great tools to take on certain problems that we see in society. None of these systems are anywhere close to self-awareness. I mean, we don't even understand what self-awareness is, right? So these systems are not even they're not really thinking in that sense. They're thinking in the sense of matching patterns, making smart decisions around patterns that they see. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to start with a few of the prepared questions, and then we'll move on to taking questions from the audience.
Want to pass the audience questions down, and we'll start.
So it's interesting, we talked about AI ethics and law and military and a bit more social approaches to it. Before we even go into the ethics of what AI does, can we talk a bit more maybe about whether or not we can even trust the results of coming from AI methods, from your opinion?
Sure. So, within the realm of the startup, you know, what we're trying to do is predict how forward the side is, and often we're asked, well, what does that mean that you're going to predict? And of course, you know, one of the things that we try to do is make sure that we don't overfit the data, right? So, you know, we could basically, you know, try to predict just on the entire sample, and then we would overfit it really well, and then a new case comes along, it's not particularly appropriate. So we do have out-of-sample testing. But for lawyers, one of the big concerns is, well, this case is complicated. You know, like you can see the factors that you have, and there's more to that than that, right? Like, you know, this judge has a certain way of thinking, and you're not capturing that. And I think one of the things that's powerful about machine learning, at least in this particular context, is it's not a panacea, but what it does is it just kind of makes it transparent in this regard what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We're not trying to provide legal advice. In fact, some people say, well, is this legal advice you're giving? You're predicting what the outcome is. What you're doing is it's not. We are making a prediction about the case based on everything that came before. A lawyer should still take that and have it be just simply one part of the overall part of their research and providing counsel to it. So this goes to really I don't think this is going to. I don't think what we're doing is replacing lawyers. If I may, there's this brief analogy. In the early '80s, there was something called VisiCalc. This was a precursor to Excel. And before this came out, accountants and bookkeepers, they used to do everything by hand, big sheets of paper. And so if you needed to redo something, they would go back and write everything else in, and it would take days and days and days. And when it first came out, there's these apocryphal stories where the early users would go back, make these changes, it would come out immediately, and then they'd sit on it for a few weeks, and then they'd bring it back to the client, and the client would think, oh my gosh, that's incredible. And you know, one of the big concerns was that this would destroy the accounting and bookkeeping industry. It turned out to be half right. The number of accounting jobs dramatically decreased, or bookkeeping jobs dramatically decreased, but the number of accounting jobs actually went up. So I think a sanguine way of looking at this, maybe it is just sanguine, is that this is what we're doing is not meant to replace what lawyers do. It's meant to replace part of what lawyers do, giving them the opportunity to deploy their energies.
Actually, maybe just to answer that from a technical perspective, in terms of trusting results from AI systems, right? So there is this whole notion of ML security. I don't know, for the folks who are technical in the audience, maybe you guys have heard of it. So Ian Goodfellow, one of the inventor of GANs, generative adversarial networks, has been doing a lot of work in this field of ML security. So to give you context on what that looks like, let's say you have these self-driving car systems, right? And there was a paper on this that came out in October, where essentially what happens is like you have the self-driving car, and let's say there's a stop sign. So the car, the lidars and the vision system on the car is supposed to detect that there is a stop sign, read the stop sign, stop. Right? I mean that's the purpose. You don't want to hit pedestrians who have right of passage and who are going to cross. It goes back to my point on what these systems actually learn. So what the researchers managed to do was to put a little sticky note with a small pattern on that stop sign, and the self-driving car doesn't stop because it doesn't recognize the stop sign. Now, what this is, these are called adversarial examples. So what they're meant to do is to fool the system into thinking that the object is not what it actually is. So this is a more, I guess, obvious example of you put a sticky note on the stop sign. So okay, well, there was something visually about it that changed. Further research has shown that you can change imperceptibly to us humans certain pixels within the image, and it completely misclassifies the object, right? So if you're looking at a banana, maybe, and this is a hypothetical example, I don't remember what they actually tested it on, but it might think a banana as a pineapple, which is okay. I guess it doesn't matter that much. But when we're talking about mission-critical systems, where let's say a robot is on an assembly line, and you can fool that into doing something and injuring someone or causing catastrophic damage, it's much more severe. And the example of the self-driving car is an obvious one, where if it keeps going, it might hit someone. The same thing is also possible in audio samples. So again, imperceptibly, you can inject noise in the audio sample, which we would not even perceive or recognize that something is wrong, and it completely misclassifies who the person is. And these are all concrete papers that have come out that have demonstrated these techniques. And why I said going back to my example on what these systems are learning. So the vision system did not actually learn what a stop sign is, right? It had some notion of what it looks like, its color or something. But then if we can change certain pixels or put a sticky note on it and completely confuse it, then it didn't actually learn anything. So, on the notion of trusting these results, I think, again, in mission critical systems where a life can be impacted, I think human oversight is still very important.
Yeah. So, I mean, trust is kind of a funny word because there's lots of systems we trust that make mistakes, and we understand that tools have limitations. So these are going to be new tools. We're going to have to understand the boundaries in which we trust them. We trust planes being flown by autopilot all the time, and sometimes they make mistakes, and Air France plane lands in the Atlantic Ocean, right, and kills 330 people. But we still trust autopilot. We have a feeling that autopilot is safer than actual pilots. The statistics don't quite bear it out as much as we think it does, right? So we all kind of have this feeling that boy, when conditions are tricky and you're landing a plane, that maybe the autopilot can adjust quicker than a real pilot can. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not true. We're hoping the pilot in the plane is making the right decision when to use autopilot or to do a manual landing. So a lot of these systems are going to be very similar. If you think that humans can be removed from the equation, then I think you're giving this too much credence to a lot of these systems. Chris Hadfield has a great story when he was captaining the space shuttle. He had to dock it with the International Space Station. So they have systems. They're supposed to be very sophisticated on the space shuttle, very intelligent, done this thousands of times, done it in simulations, real life. He looked out the window and he saw the system hadn't lined up the lock with the shuttle. And so he looks out the window and says, hey, something is wrong here. Calls mission control, and they said, no, everything is fine. The system is telling us you're going to dock. He said, yeah, it doesn't look like we're going to crash into the side of the space station. So he turns the system off, and he takes manual control. And then Houston starts screaming at him, so he turns off the radio. He doesn't want Houston screaming at him. And he manually guides the space shuttle into the dock. And later on, they discovered that there was a bug in the system that had been used thousands of times. And you cannot get away from this. Like, something about looking out the window and seeing something wrong that beat the system that everybody else believed got it right. So I think if you start thinking these systems, I mean, so, of course they trust that system because, 999 times out of 1,000, it's going to do a better job than a human docking. But there's that time that human judgment says something is just wrong here. Right? If that pilot in that Air France plane would have probably figured out that there's something wrong, that the plane is not flying the way it should be, and it's actually going into the ocean even though the reading said it was 34,000 feet. So, humans have this ability. So, I mean, what Abby said, that we have this ability to understand slight perturbations of the world. We're pretty good. If you change the system slightly, change the conditions slightly, figuring out pretty quickly what has to happen. A lot of times these systems are not designed. It's not that they can't do it, they're just never designed to do it. You heard about the car that drove under a semi-trailer, right? Because it had never been trained, apparently on white semi-trailers on sunny days when these things are reflecting. Every one of you would have been able to tell, even though you probably have never seen that situation before, you said something doesn't look right up there. At least I want to slow down because it doesn't look right to me, and then realize I see tires on either end far away, so maybe there's something up there. I'm going to just stop because something bad could happen. So the system was just not designed for jackknife white trucks on a sunny day on a clear road, which kind of sounds strange, right? But the system just wasn't designed to do it. On the other hand, if you're really tired, it might be better to let that car go on autopilot than to you keep trying to drive it and probably drive it into the ditch. So the trust is a conditional trust, right? You trust it in certain situations, but it doesn't take away from human judgment.
Now we will move on towards audience questions that we've received here. So we have 30 minutes left. So we will start with this one question. So this is addressed to Abby, but you talked about the importance of end-to-end stakeholder involvement in inclusivity and metrics for ethical AI development. How can we convince AI creators to do this? Education is important, but having the information does not guarantee that people will actually use these resources. So how do we convince creators that it's in their interest to mobilize this knowledge when they design it? This is from Kevin from the Faculty of Information.
So great question. Obviously, is it 100% in their interest if it takes away from profits? Maybe not. So they might not go that way, right? But I think when we're talking about AI creators, let's say the people who are designing and developing these systems, it comes down to having your own sort of moral compass that would drive you in a certain direction, and that only goes so far. Beyond that, I think something like a code of business ethics within a company that we have in companies that say you should not accept bribes or should not do something that's conflict of interest with what the company is doing, so you don't take on contracts with another company or things of that nature, right? So having that sort of code of AI ethics within the context of that organization is another step. But I think the biggest step is going to be in terms of having some sort of mandate or requirement from legislators, from policymakers, not to limit or prohibit or inhibit the research that is happening, but to put a strong moral and ethical compass on it while it is taking place. How do we incentivize that? I think it would come once you have that. It would be a requirement, but additionally, having that call come out from the community themselves, especially if you're talking about academia, I think that's already a strong enough incentive. I mean, you see it with REBs. I think they're called REBs in Canada and IRBs, the ethics review boards in the United States. Whenever you're doing such sort of studies which might involve human data, which can be misused in some sort of fashion, you need to go through that ethics approval process. So having an institution that perhaps at least gives guidance, if not completely legislates that, would be a practical first step. And then, I think maybe Albert, you can add more maybe on the spot. But in terms of if there is possibility or precedent in terms of the legality of imposing such restrictions.
Yeah, so you did put me on the spot because I don't have a clear answer on it. I mean, everything is so nascent. And in some ways, we don't even know what questions we should be asking. So it makes it a promising time to try to tackle some of these. And I think, again, just in the narrow realm of legal profession, just building on what you're thinking, it does beg the question: if something goes wrong, who is supposed to be responsible? And so a lawyer draws upon something that we build and gives advice to a client, and it turns out that the prediction is not what the court did. Now, if we take a step away from it, we can understand that judges may make decisions that run contrary to precedent. Right? There's a lot. I mean, both in Canada and the U.S., it's replete with examples where, years later, we realize that was totally out of step with underlying constitutional principles. Yet it happens. So who's to blame? Who's responsible? I should say at that moment. Unfortunately, one of the narrow text of our business, we emphasize we are not liable. We are not providing legal advice, and the way in which we're hedging at this moment is we provide our services only to professionals. Now, it's going to raise the question: what happens if this is true more broadly? What happens if they're not used by professionals? Or you have a system, an expert system that, if used by professionals, like if a pilot uses machine learning to make decisions, well, you know that you have a backup and that person doesn't have a skill. What happens if someone who doesn't have that context is using it in a way that may be unintended design? I don't think it's well thought out. Certainly not.
But I think it's perhaps what you're saying in terms of providing these systems to professionals, right? I think it goes back to the point that these are people who have had years of rigorous training, who are, who have vetted credentials, who come from accredited institutions, and all of that gives us a sort of, I guess misusing the word trust here, but a sense of trust in doing that, right? And I think it's a little bit like using WebMD for yourself and arriving every time that you have brain cancer, even if your stomach is hurting, to going to an actual professional and getting professional advice. So I think it's a little bit like that, and that the idea of having that code of ethics, I think, in terms of a practical first step, I think that's the way to go.
So now we have a question from Heather from the audience. How possible is human surveillance of machine learning programs in an era when machine learning can exceed the professional limits that of the human professional checking on it? And how realistic is the idea of implanting morality in machine learning?
Well, so I would say that it's not. Coding morality is not that straightforward, but the designers have to be very aware of moral issues in the design of the system. And I'm not sure that you can really say a computer program has morality. I think we'd be hard-pressed to define morality of a computer program. It's the designers of the systems that have to be aware of what they're designing and how they're used. I mean, it goes back, and so you're saying also, the people who then use these systems also have to be trained in making sure those systems are used in a moral manner. So that the systems themselves, it's, a knife can be used for many different things, right? It's the same knife. These are tools that can be used in lots of different ways. The designer of the tool has to make sure that its purpose is ethical. And the person using the tool has to make sure they're using it for the purposes that it should be used. But I'm not sure that it's so easy to say the tool itself is moral and ethical, although I'm sure we'd find an example where I'm wrong. But I think in the big picture, it's really the people around it.
I guess, so the question you said was, how do we make sure that human can surveil a system that surpasses it and surpasses
How
the
possible
human
is to keep on checking on it and making sure it's delivering safe results, such as, for instance, not misconducting the shuttle into some spots of the.
Well, I think, it's in I guess, again, you can probably find counterexamples, but if you can establish clear metrics ahead of time in terms of what needs to happen, right? And these can be, let's say, higher level metrics in terms of the number of pedestrians that a self-driving car gets, which is, I don't think it's that high today, but it's probably in the single digits. But that itself can be a metric. And again, we can say that 10 years down the line, the system is much better at driving than we are. But if you have to have some sort of human oversight in terms of determining the safety performance of that system, if you have a clearly established metric that says, well, you should hit less than 1 in a million pedestrians, that's fairly easy to adhere to and check that the system is meeting that safety standard. And if it isn't, then something is going wrong, and then you have a process to rectify that error. So I think establishing clear metrics that are agreed upon ahead of time before you even sort of get into who is surveilling the system and what's coming out of it, I think that's one sort of practical step to look at.
Just ambiguity is my question.
Yeah.
It was between what you two had said. It was about the YouTube for kids, and that I wasn't quite sure how the remixes were being done of the children's programs, and whether the remixes were something that was a program that was sort of let loose or not. And if so, that program can easily slide into lots of places, because you were basically saying you need human surveillance on something we normally think is technological surveillance of us. And I like that sort of chicken and egg idea. But you did say that you're thinking about, is it possible in the future to have some sort of way of encoding some sort of ethical sense in machine learning. So I mean, it was about the sort of, you know, the hope that humans really could do that when machine learning can spill out into all kinds of messy directions that we're not looking at, not safety standards, but you know, ethically questionable.
Yeah, so suppose you're designing an algorithm to sell more widgets, and it turns out you're bankrupting people.
Mm.
That was never your intention, designing that algorithm. I mean, is it the algorithm? Is it the thing that's putting these ads up that's getting people to buy widgets? Should that have an ethical piece built into it? Is it then the designer? Is it the users that are now using this algorithm? I mean, the same algorithm may be fantastic in a different context, right? So it's not, at least we like to believe as computer scientists, we designed a great algorithm. It's now the use of that algorithm that's, you know, getting kids to smoke. It wasn't our intention to get kids to smoke. So in the same way, if you've got YouTube changing kinds of programming because it's getting them more advertisers, who's taking responsibility? My personal belief is end users take responsibility for everything they do. That's just, I think that we get into lots of funny business if we say end users are not, they're deploying systems, but they don't take responsibility for the outcomes. Because lots of systems can be used in lots of funny ways. And you know, in the end, people have to take responsibility for their own action in deploying the system. That's just my belief. Of course, as a computer scientist, when we develop the system, it takes load off us if we believe that. So I mean, I can be convinced that, you know, I don't think we should be doing as much military research as we do. That we can say the military is killing people with drones, not us. I mean, I'm actually pretty opposed. All this military money is floating around right now. So it's not 100%, but I do think this idea of separating yourself from the use of a system is one that's bothersome.
But I just want to clarify the YouTube Kids part, just so that, you know, everybody's on the same page. So it wasn't YouTube that was pushing that content, right? Because it wasn't YouTube that was creating the content, it was the one indeed who was pushing that content, because the algorithm is attuned to finding videos that you as a user like, and it will try to show you as many of those as it can so that you stay on the platform for longer. Now the videos themselves, the macabre videos, how were they being created? Initially it was humans that were building you know, softer variants of the videos that tend to do well. So kids like Bugs Bunny, you know, so they wanted to. So they were humans that were trying to make variants of those videos so that so how does the YouTube model work? As a content creator, as someone who uploads videos, the higher the number of views, roughly, the higher the number of views on your videos, the greater the check that you will get from Google. Because they send you a check for how well your videos are doing in terms of the number of times ads are viewed, clicked on. They have a whole process that without going into the details of that. But so what these content creators initially, they were sort of humans that were slicing and putting together these videos. Later on, they deployed machine learning approaches to automate that process because it's better to do it at scale and at minimal cost than to have humans that sit and manually create those videos. Because if you can now churn out 10,000 of those videos a day, you've 10,000x your revenue stream, right? So that's just to clarify that was the premise of that whole example.
Sorry, just to add one thing. There's this notion, perhaps naive, that you can build a perfect mousetrap. Build a system that it's iterative, and then boom, you suddenly digitally kind of masters. And I think, again, in the realm of law, I think that's a fiction. So the example again, building something that you talked about. So you can imagine that you have a system where you don't want discrimination that's explicit, right? You want to discriminate basis of gender or race. Then there could be sort of what's described in the law as like disparate impact. Right? You're not using those factors, but using factors that correlate so that it has the same effect. Well, you can imagine over time things that kind of contribute to a disparate impact may change. So factors that are kind of second degree today, those second degree factors may be different. So I think and courts are basically, they're kind of the experts. They're like, well, whatever you did, whatever your intentions may have been, we now have to come in and evaluate, was this reasonable? Or in the case of constitutional issues, was this in compliance with constitutional mandate dictates? And so the answer is it is or it isn't, but it's one of those things where intentions notwithstanding, the courts are going to look at this after the fact. And so I think this means that this iterative process of always having the human just kind of do a gut check, like the way you're describing the pilot looking out the window. That has to, I think, certainly within law, and I think probably even more broadly, you need to have that process.
Just come back to a question you mentioned earlier about the idea that we're not going to be in a situation where robots are being evaluated for rights, and I can see that absolutely. But we are already in a situation, for instance, whereby in certain sectors, a corporation can be recognized as an individual. So how far away are we from the point where a system could be recognized as an individual?
That's corporate rights.
Right. I mean, it's funny because
Maybe you'd want to, in case everybody isn't familiar.
Right. So one of the, I think this is probably more salient in the U.S. context than it is in the U.S. context. The question about, is a corporation a person, or does it have certain rights that people have? This all came up in the context of campaign. Right? And so the idea was, this is all about Citizens United 2010 Supreme Court decision, which the court said basically corporations can give as much money as people can give as much money, but so can corporations. And this basically led to the floodgates. It actually destroyed the political system as we knew it. Like until 2010, political parties, the national political parties controlled everything. They were the gatekeepers of what money went to candidates. And you can argue one of the byproducts of this is that it allowed someone like Trump to get elected, because when we went back 30 years ago, big party leaders would have been like, we don't want Trump, which is what the Republican parties were saying in 2016. But because he could finance through wealthy billionaires, he was able to essentially override that. Anyway, so how does this relate to the question that you asked? So corporations have certain elements of personhood, as the courts have identified, which allows them to give as much money. So we can argue the reason why this was all motivated was there were humans behind this that were going to be the direct beneficiaries, right? Because what is good for a corporation, and that's why they get money, is then going to be, it's going to be essentially some type of kickback that will benefit the corporation, which will then residually benefit the directors, the officers, and the shareholders.
Precisely. So can the same process work?
Right. Well, I say exactly, and that's why you can imagine, if the incentive is such that identifying or granting personhood or certain rights to machines will help directors, officers, shareholders, then it's really kind of that's a financial gain from that care. Corporations, that's what's clearly evident. It's not you don't have to stretch the imagination too much to see how that could also apply.
I mean, in some ways, so I agree completely. That kind of argument will be made. But that's still different than an inalienable right of a sentient being, which is the way that Star Trek portrays. Yeah, like a Star Trek Data, right? Is that what it's called? Data, right? It has some inalienable rights as a machine. That's the part that I think we're getting way too far ahead of ourselves. But if I can get rich by giving data some rights, then maybe I start arguing that way.
So police officers are governed by the law and a very strict code of discipline, and you can complain about it. Engineers are licensed. Physicians are licensed. Lawyers are licensed. But what I hear you saying in terms of the ethical judgmental proposition for the computer scientists who are designing these systems, that somebody should be raising the regulatory issue. Shouldn't these folks, if they're in an area like AI and system design, shouldn't they be licensed? So there is some recourse in the event 1 in 1,000 is an awful person who doesn't really care about the very issues you folks have raised so thoughtfully. I just wonder whether, or is that because the field is so divergent, it's so broad, and so many thousands of really bright, able people are in it. It's not a practical discussion. I don't know.
No. Lots of people have made this argument that software engineers should be professionalized like an engineering profession. it does lead you to the whole question of democratization of technology. So right now, 12-year-old can go and write a piece of software, put it on the App Store, and get rich, right? So Angry Birds, I'm not sure who wrote that, but you know, a 12-year-old could write Angry Birds, right? And make $30 million. So I think society has decided that technology should be democratized. So everybody should have equal access to technology, which means that you can't really license the profession because the people who are unlicensed have every right to write software, just have the license. But it has been a huge discussion, and you know, whether system critical software should come from licensed individuals who then take professional responsibility for the impact and outcomes of their systems. So far, society has not gone in that direction. In fact, all the moves to try to regulate the profession failed just because so many people operate outside. The bulk would operate outside the licensing regime no matter how hard we tried to license. And in fact, I'd argue society is moving the other direction. So there's huge movements to teach all kids to write software because software is like math and reading, writing, and software development is somehow now considered equal. Like, I don't believe that at all. I think, you know, basic skills are way more important than writing software, but society seems to be pushing hard in this direction, right? That we should give every 10-year-old courses in writing software. And as the toolkits get stronger, like we have very sophisticated toolkits now that you can tap. We have toolkits for deep learning that you can tap into. So as you know, broad sets of people access these toolkits, it's not clear that we can put the genie into that particular model. And I'm not even 100% sure we should, because a lot of the creativity has come from left field, not from core professionals.
So we're going to take one more question and then we're going to end for today. And remind everybody that we're going to convene in the JCR again to have tea and coffee so we can continue the conversation over there. So
I just wanted to add on to what you were saying. The reason is also many developers don't come from accredited universities. They can be like off of it, and like with respect to like teaching kids, I've heard that the argument for that is actually because they want kids to learn how to problem solve and solve creative, in innovative manners. So an example is the Raspberry Pi controllers. They come for $3 and they actually have Wi-Fi and everything enabled, and you can literally do like electronic engineering electronics with it. And the idea behind that is to teach kids to problem solve. Whether or not it actually does or doesn't, I don't know. It's up for discussion, but it's actually the reason why software developers are never like actually accredited, like can be given a license, is because of that type of.
You see, the opposite could happen because technology is making knowledge so pervasive. What if I could be as good as an accredited professional and learned it all on my own? Like, what if I learned all the medicine on my own and I'm actually getting better outcomes on diagnosis than the medical professional because I built toolkits and I've learned this big body of knowledge? What if I just did that on my own? Should I be able to practice medicine? Should there be a system for me to get licensed to practice medicine? So I think technology is actually asking much more sophisticated questions in the other direction.
I think, I mean, you know, to add on to what you're saying, right? I think the question is, what does society demand at that point, right? I mean, do you go to a quack to get your, you know, your leg fixed, or, you know, if you have, you know, congestion in your chest or whatever problem that you have, right? Do you go to a quack or do you go to a licensed medical professional? It's we you know, implicitly have a certain degree of trust in that licensed professional, right? Which is why you would go to that person and not a quack. I think the same thing can be said without stifling the democratization of this technology, is that you can have people who learn these techniques who can be just as good, but perhaps when they are working within the, you know, within the framework of an organization, let's say to deploy, you know, the way your newsfeed is structured on Facebook, maybe then we make sure that they have a certain degree of, you know, licensing or some, you know, code of ethics that they comply to, or at least they're aware of it, right? So I think that still, you know, meets that goal of not inhibiting access.
Except we don't take, those people don't take responsibility for the outcomes of it.
Well, I think that is what we need to.
Right?
Yeah.
That's,
So I think we're primed to move into the other room and keep this going. I just want to again take a moment to thank, again, for those of you who weren't here earlier, we were explaining that the Science at Massey program is a program for everyone who's interested in the implications of science and technology, policy, society. It's a very, very broad program that we're trying to initiate very much in the manner inspired by the concept of college on certain groups. And it's a very grassroots process where the junior fellows and alumni fellows get together, volunteer in various groups. It's a very dynamic process over the course of the year. Anyone can join in. This particular program was executed by 4 co-chairs, to which we are deeply grateful for their unending enthusiasm, an incredible organization. And I'd just like to take a moment to have you join me in thanking Jesse, Charlie, Amir, and Steve.
Well, first of all, thank you to our panelists for a very enthusiastic discussion and a lot of food for thought. We'd also like to thank, sorry, I have a list of, thank you somewhere. Okay, well, off the top
The
of
classic Oxford moment. We read out the wrong best picture.
well, I think we'd like to thank all the Massey support team. So Hugh Siegel, Amala Marin, Emily Walker, Darlene, Greg. Sorry, oh here it is. Okay, Kelly, as well as Amala. So Massey has always been really supportive of our initiatives here, as well as the various members of the Massey community. So Sabrina Tang, Francesco Ducci, Misha Boutier, Maria Javed, Phil Davina, Camille Malcolm, Amanda Loder, Siobhan Roberts, and Alexa Aletha. The last few were also members of our Science at Massey team. Finally, I'd like to thank our panelists once again, so Charu, Ludwig, and Jonathan for the first panel, as well as Arvin, Abhishek, and Albert for the second panel, as well as Brian Cantwell-Smith, who's sad that he isn't able to join us today. So, and once again, thank you, Barbara, for making sure that everything goes smoothly and that we're on top of it. So I thank you all for coming today. It was a really nice discussion.
Coffee and tea are in the next room.